This is Module 2, and let's talk about some of the reasons why it's hard for some people to downsize. The first is a utilitarian value system, and these are people who have a strong feeling that something is still good. Why should I release it? It's perfectly fine. I paid a lot of money for it. It can be used again, and you're right, it totally can be used again. A perfect example of it would be something like this mascara, right? If I look at it, then I think like, well, there's still a lot of mascara in it. It's good. I should keep it. Well, now I happen to know that this particular mascara is beyond the 3 month shelf life that it's been open. And so typically with makeup, it's not recommended to keep mascara, particularly an eye product, longer than 3 months for health reasons. And so that would be an example of something that could probably get released. Now we could say mascara, that's, it's just a tiny little thing. What's the harm in keeping it? But we often see things like maybe unused linens. Imagine if it's an unopened blanket that's just been sitting, or a comforter set, or pillows, or decorative items, vases, artwork, things that, yes, they're still good, but they're not being used. And we see it a lot with clothing. So clothes that haven't been worn, but they're still good, or they were expensive, or we paid a lot of money for them. And so when we have that as our value system, then we tend to sometimes want to hang on to things a little bit more because we know that they are still good and they were expensive. And I just want to challenge you, if you find yourself coming up with that, to consider that yes, it's still good, and yes, it could be used, but is it going to be used by you? So we know that it hasn't been used yet because a lot of times we're finding things that are unopened, and that could be things like candles, bath products, all kinds of unopened, like gourmet foods and snacks and wines and candies. And so sometimes the utilitarian value is so strong that it's almost like we're saving things for someday. And unfortunately, I've seen in many cases where I'm clearing out the home of a decedent, and we found that they were saving things that were still good and were new, that unfortunately that someday that they were going to use those things that were still good and new and unopened never came because the person passed on before they were able to actually use it. So if utilitarian values is something that makes it harder for you to downsize, then I want to encourage you to challenge yourself. As yes, it's still good, and it could be used, but is it something that you really are going to use, or is it something that maybe if you were to release now, it might have the potential of being used and enjoyed by somebody else? Next, we have emotional reasons. So sometimes people just dread the thought of downsizing because an emotion that comes up a lot is it makes them sad. And in the book, I cite a story about a wonderful family, and the wife in the family, she had a strong desire to have another child, and her husband wasn't really sure if that was in the future for them or not. But they were preparing to move, and so as we started to work on downsizing the garage, then all these emotions started coming up for her. And when we found the baby items, it was just really difficult for her to downsize. And every time we would go to do that and start to release the baby items from the previous children, who certainly had grown out of the baby items, then it was really difficult. It made her really sad, to the point where the whole downsizing process would get shut down. We'd have to move to another area. So unfortunately, we weren't able to complete that process, and they ended up packing up the items and moving on to their new location, which was out of my area, with all the baby items. Another emotion that could get triggered is anger. So sometimes as we're going through the downsizing process, we find things that remind us of something that was, maybe didn't go so well. Could have been a relationship, it could have been a job, it could have been a property that we used to own. And we find artifacts and memories and paperwork sometimes of things that kind of make us mad. And then that these emotions are coming up, and then we don't want to do the downsizing process. So just notice if you start to downsize, if emotions are being triggered. And in some cases, it could be great to talk to somebody else, either a trusted friend about it, or maybe in some cases even a medical professional, if you find that the downsizing process is bringing emotions up for you that are really hard for you to continue on with. A third reason why it can be hard for someone to downsize is sentimental attachment. And that is when we feel connected to an item that might belong to somebody else that we love or we loved. They could be living or could have passed on, but the item reminds me of them. And so we feel like out of respect for that person, we need to hang on to that item. So a perfect example would be this pin here that belonged to my mother's. Now, when I look at it, I think it's not really my style, and I don't really like it that much, but I loved my mother. So how could I get rid of that thing when, it makes me think of her, and the thought of releasing it would be disrespectful because it was hers. Now, this is just a little tiny pin, but imagine if we were doing that with all kinds of other things. There's nothing wrong with wanting to hang on to things that remind us of somebody else. It makes us feel good, it makes us feel happy, and we love that person or we loved them. But when we're hanging on to so many things that we don't have room for something else, then that's when sometimes it might be time to reevaluate whether our sentimental attachment is really serving us. And so maybe we could release some of the items, and it's not likely that we're going to forget them, but we could take a photo of them so that we can always have that picture of them if we fear that we might forget about them. Another place where we might have sentimental attachment is when we're remembering things that of a different season in our life. So maybe we have sport memorabilia, or clothing from another, when we were in a different profession, or maybe we are a parent right now, a stay-at-home parent, a full-time parent, and we used to have clothing from a career that could have represented a different time. It also could have been when we were at a different body size. So all those sentimental reasons will cause us to want to hang on to things, and they can further impede the downsizing process. We've spoken about utilitarian values, emotional reasons, and sentimental attachment, which can make it harder for people in the downsizing process. But sometimes there's something else, and that something else could be a brain-related condition such as ADHD, anxiety, depression, addiction. Anybody who's experiencing one of those conditions, whether it's more of a temporary thing, situational perhaps, or maybe they have a diagnosis, or it might be something that they have been trying to manage for a long time, but those kinds of things can make it harder for somebody in both the organizing process as well as when they're trying to downsize. And so if you or someone you know is experiencing one of those conditions, then I really recommend that you try to get somebody to help you with the downsizing process. And in the book, then I give some ideas of some places where you might be able to get help, which would include maybe a friend, a neighbor, your spiritual community, the help of a professional, including a professional organizer or a senior move downsize person. You could get an accountability buddy, but someone who can help in the process, because downsizing is really hard, and maybe somebody else in the process who can assist you can make it a little bit easier for you. What I don't recommend is a judgmental family member to help you, because sometimes they can make what is already a difficult process even more difficult. And if you have any of those people in your life, then you probably know what I'm talking about. So maybe they wouldn't be the best in this particular scenario. I give several examples of some of these brain-based conditions and some potential solutions to help people who are experiencing them. So the first is a case study about Susie, who has ADHD, and for her, she's not really sure where to begin in the downsizing process. And when she gets started, then she ends up kind of going from room to room as she's trying to downsize. And what happens is each time she goes in and works in a room, then it kind of ends up a little bit messier than when she began. And this ping-ponging process is not going to allow her to see the value and the progress of downsizing that would really motivate her to keep going. So in that case, what I was suggesting was a helper who could maybe help keep her focused, and also to do sort of a pre-sort for her. So maybe with the linens, she could go through all the things and make recommendations of what she might be able to release. That way she can minimize all the decision-making process on Susie and make her downsizing process go a little bit smoother. So next we have Jeremy, who tends to worry a lot, and it's because he has anxiety. So people tell him, well, you shouldn't worry about that, or stop thinking that way. But the anxiety will take over for him and he'll continue to worry. And with the downsizing process, then naturally he's worrying a bit more, and he's worried that if he downsizes some things, what if he needs them later on? Or worse, what if something bad happens if he gets rid of that thing? So with him, it would be great to be supportive and understanding. Sometimes just being with somebody who's worrying is enough for them, and they can actually go through their own things if you're just there providing reassurance. And you want to talk about what those concerns are. And perhaps if you're doing some packing, then it'd be a good idea to pack into clear containers so that somebody who's feeling anxious can kind of know where their belongings are and exactly what's happening during the downsizing process. Our third and final example is Emma, and she is 78 and someone who traditionally has kept a very neat and tidy house. She had a couple collections, but they were very well maintained. And then she lost her son and her husband pretty close together, creating, a whole lot of loss and trauma for her. And as time went on, then it became increasingly more difficult for her to maintain her home and her collection. Her home started to fill up, but now she's faced with trying to downsize, and she's just not really ready to do it. And it's going to be really important in a scenario like that to be very patient and understanding, and expect that it's going to take a considerable amount of time, because there's going to be a need for some ground rules to be established and to really keep that person informed with what's happening. And sometimes we end up, not being able to downsize as much as we would like to, because in some cases we just might be faced with a deadline, or the resistance might be a little bit hard. But the more we can provide reassurance, establish ground rules, and really stick to them, then I think the more progress we're really going to be able to see with helping that person downsize. Some additional tips for somebody who's dealing with something else, meaning a brain-based condition, would be to create a plan. How are you going to go about this process? You want to focus on one thing at a time. This whole multitasking thing, we know by now that it's highly overrated. So just try to do one thing. So just work on downsizing, not downsizing and doing social media at the same time. Just do downsizing and maybe schedule it and do it for a while, and then you can go on to something else. Finish a task before starting a new one. So important, and perhaps the most critical tip that I can provide, because that's how you're going to see progress, and progress is going to allow you to stay motivated and keep going. And remember, we're trying to minimize the overwhelm and stress. So whether it's you that's doing the downsizing or you're helping somebody else to downsize, then I just encourage you to be gentle with yourself or with somebody else, because this can be such a hard process. And so it's stressful as it is, but certainly if somebody has something else that they're trying to manage, then downsizing, sometimes it just feels like one more thing that is going to be really hard, and it can be. So if we can minimize the stress and overwhelm as much as possible, I know that you're going to have better results.